So, can I give a very warm welcome to Felicity Folwer and Will Ritson of Jing, who are going to take the circle into this foray into tea. The circle is, of course, a broad church, and we do not just wine, but beer and other things that appeal to the senses. So Felicity has been with Jing she's traveled far and wide, meeting tea producers, talking to the world's top chefs and their teams, and sharing her passion with tea drinkers. She and Will make up the tea experience at Jing, which means really doing anything they can to help tea lovers get a more wonderful experience from drinking this wonderful beverage tea, which has been around, I think, since about 2,500 BC. Will, I think, joined about 2 years ago, and he's designing and hosting tea flights in store and now online. And he's got a lot of experience and understanding of traditional teas and cultures from Asia. So thank you very much for coming along. I hope the people have got their sachets, the ones that are going to actually brew up. And let me hand over to Felicity and to Will.
Great, Victor, thank you very much for having us. Yeah, it's great to be here. It's a perfect time of day for drinking tea. And I think you kind of covered it in the introduction, but it's kind of one of our favourite things is to drink tea with other people. And it's been a little bit restricted over the last year, but so thank goodness for Zoom and for events like this. What we thought we would do today, we have an hour, and we know you guys are big into wine, so we know that you have good palates, kind of a good, you'll have a very good basic understanding. There's a number of very strong similarities and themes between wine and tea. So we don't want to go, I'm going to do a brief introduction to who Jing are and a brief introduction to the Camellia sinensis plant and kind of what tea is. But most of the session, we're going to dive into tasting some of the teas. Little bit of admin first. It will be, well, between us, Will and I will cover the different sections. But if anyone has any questions, it doesn't need to be a lecture. It's not meant to be kind of overly formal at all. Either like shout up and kind of take yourselves off mute and ask directly, or pop your questions in the chat. And between us, we will make sure they get all covered. We'll also keep 5-10 minutes at the end to go through any other questions. Other admin, hopefully everyone received the note yesterday saying that what we need for the session, it's basically your tea sachets, a kettle close by, ideally with freshly drawn and filtered, like water. Like the majority of, when you drink tea, the majority of it is water, so the quality of the water is fairly important. You'll need your tiare, hopefully if you've received your tasting packs, or if you haven't got a tiare, your teapot, and cups to drink with. In between the tastings, we'll give you guys a few moments to kind of get like do the switch over and things, so don't worry too much. We're going to share, well, Will, you're going to share the screen and we will kick off with a short presentation. But yeah, like I said, it's meant to be fun, it's meant to be lots of tea drinking, so jump in with questions and enjoy.
Awesome.
Great. So what I wanted to start off by doing is just literally by introducing Jing. We are a tea brand. I know from speaking to Liz and Victor earlier, a few of you will know Jing already. We've done quite a lot of work with Andrew Jefford, who I think is part of your organisation or your community. And so some of you might already know what we do. We've been around for 15, 16 years now. It's never changed what we do. We're all about sourcing the highest quality teas and sharing them as widely as we can with tea lovers. And what makes us a little bit different, a little bit perhaps interesting in the context of the UK specifically, is that we have this really very narrow tea culture in the UK. We like English breakfast tea, kind of strong black tea that's not really associated with the place anymore, often comes locked away in tea bags. We often add milk and sugar in order to make it palatable, and that's kind of over the last century, that's really become our tea culture. Ed, who you'll see in the left-hand side of the picture here, spent a lot of his 20s in China. He was actually studying Chinese medicine, and when he was there, he realized that there's this kind of whole other world of tea, a world that is richly connected with the places that tea is grown. It's connected in terms of people. So the people who are growing the tea often have been doing it for generations. It's something that's kept within a community, something that's handed down through families, through communities. And also it's something that people will take a little bit more or maybe not take a little bit more care over it, but have a little bit more awareness of where it's from, the fact that it comes from kind of literally the land, and it's something natural, and have a stronger connection to it. And this idea that tea can foster connection, can have an incredible array of flavors, because again, like if we think of wine, like the growing things in totally different places, you're going to get, and growing different cultivars, different types of tea bush or grape, you're going to get totally different flavors, not just this one generic flavor of English breakfast. Ed kind of realized that this was something different and something special, and so set up Jing. I will read just the top half of this slide, which I think kind of encompasses it more clearly, which is to say, we're on a mission to enable people to enjoy the most fulfilling tea experiences and to enable tea producers and their environments to thrive. Those two things go hand in hand. So the best tea experiences for tea lovers is going to be like teas that taste really good, but also teas that people can connect to, the people and the places that they come from, and the very nature of tea production. Actually, I'll cover that when I go on to the third slide about organic. But hopefully that makes sense. How do we do this idea of fulfilling tea experiences? How are we making sure that the people producing the tea and the environments are thriving? First up is single garden tea. So single garden is just kind of exactly what it says on the tin, I think is a good phrase. It takes us the concept of single origin one step further. So single origin we trace to a particular place, and like over time, coffee, chocolate and tea to some extent quality will be defined by the place or the origin it's from. We dive deeper into the origins and go to the individual gardens, the individual places and people who are producing the very best teas within that specific origin. What enables us to dive deeper into those origins and to kind of source and find these distinctive single garden teas are, of course, the people who are making the teas. We can call them kind of master craftsmen, tea masters. Often they're very humble people. They will literally call themselves farmers, tea farmers. Unless we get to know them, unless we kind of spend time with them and really work together and build personal relationships with them, it doesn't work. We don't get that connection. We're not able to then communicate those stories to the tea drinkers and enable that idea of fulfilling tea experiences, and also help people to understand whether you're, so in this picture here we've got Mr. Ishiyama, who's working in a very specific way in a tiny area in Shizuoka in Japan, who's still he still does a traditional hand rolling technique to get very specific flavors from his teas. Telling his story, sharing that with tea lovers enables people over time, and the more people they get to know, to find the flavors, find the origins and the places that they're going to love, and that's going to give them satisfaction from tea. One other point on personal relationships and on the producers, the two things, when we meet people, it's almost immediately obvious that we will work together, because if they're equally kind of as obsessed with flavor and obsessed with taste and caring for the environment. So I think I've just got two more on what we do. So prioritizing organic, that's hugely important, as we all know. Again, you don't need me to explain why organic's important in terms of the planet. But what makes organic interesting in the context of tea is also it's a massive endeavor to switch your garden to organic. You lose a lot of yield. And again, I know that you guys know all this from wine anyway. You lose a lot of your yield. It's very expensive. It's quite risky. Often, if you've got other farmers in the area who aren't practicing organic, it can be difficult to persuade them to make sure that your area is protected. This is a picture of a man in Taiwan, Mr. Chen, who produces our Alishan Oolong Tea, and actually he had a lot of problems with his family, kind of looking at him and thinking, why on earth would you want to ever go organic when it's a lot of work and a lot of money, etc. And after 7 years, it took him 7 years of working in this way to convince his dad, who had been looking after the farm for years before him, that actually the tea tastes better. It ended up, for Mr. Chen specifically, being less hard work, but also a much, much richer, more diverse and healthier environment for him to bring up his children. So we get better tasting tea, healthier tea, better environments, but also it's better for the producers. It's completely unhealthy and bad for them to walk around spraying pesticides for years and years and years. So prioritizing organic is a key thing that we do. And then the final one is championing loose leaf. So what if everyone, I think everyone here hopefully has one of the tasting packs, and what you got in your tasting pack was our Jing tier. So a teapot, and the whole purpose of this teapot is to make loose tea drinking as easy as possible. Loose tea is better than tea bags for well, I've picked out on this particular slide, I've picked out 4 different reasons. The environment is obvious, there's less packaging and less processing. We did a short study in December last year, and we worked out that with the UK last year drinking 31 billion tea bags, that was enough waste to cover 61,000 football pitches of. So if you imagine your tea bag, like your tea bag material, if you get rid of your tea, you could, with all of those tea bags, you could cover 61,000 football pitches. I mean, that's a huge amount of waste. It's also a huge amount of energy going into the making of the tea bags. So loose tea, like easy one, it's better for the environment. Also pay for the tea, not the packaging. With like, if you were to buy our teas, and this would be the same for any tea company, the same tea loose, the same tea in tea bags, the loose one's always going to be more economical, cheaper, because it hasn't had that extra processing added onto it. What's a little bit more exciting about loose tea is the access to the larger variety of teas. So a huge amount of the teas that come from China, that come from Japan, that come from Taiwan, teas from these tiny small gardens, small single gardens, there's not enough of it to make into tea bags. They'll never end up in a tea bag. So if you have access to loose leaf and you're confident making it and drinking it, then you'll have a much wider world to explore. And then the final point, and hopefully we will see this when we dive into the tasting, is that it becomes so much more of an experience. You can see the leaves, you can see the different colors, and when we make the 3 teas that we're going to taste today, you'll see the leaves all look completely different. You can really kind of see the nature in them and connect to them a lot more. The next part is going to be just, again, 3 slides just on introducing what tea is. Does anyone have any questions from the first section or anything that's not clear? Doesn't seem like it. So the main thing is single garden tea is going to taste distinctive. It's better for the people who make it. It's better for the environment. And it gives us as tea drinkers a whole kind of huge depth and breadth of variety to explore. So what is tea? Tea is the Camellia sinensis plant. It's the drink that comes from the leaves of the Camellia sinensis plant. And the processing of tea is very, very simple. Fundamentally, it's just leaves that are picked and then dried. And how the drying happens, how quickly it happens, and whether the leaves are kind of manipulated before they're dried decides which type of tea you have. On the next slide, I just wanted to give you 2 pictures of the Camellia sinensis plant. So you've got different varietals here, but I thought this was a nice illustration of, again, the breadth of tea production. On the left-hand side, we have got some tea gardens in Shizuoka in Japan. So these are very, very neatly cultivated. They are kept at kind of waist height. They are pruned back year after year after year. And the leaves, the top leaves and the top buds are really, really prized in that area. On the right-hand side, you've got a wild tea tree. So the same Camellia sinensis plant, but this one has been left to go wild. And when they're left to go wild, they will become arborous trees, and this one would be about 10 to 12 meters tall. You can see much darker leaves, much bigger leaves, like big thick branches and trunk there. And I thought it gives a good indication of the breadth of the Camellia sinensis plant. Where are the traditional tea growing regions? So the places that we source from are China, Japan, Taiwan, India, Sri Lanka. If we just click, exactly, you'll see these areas. One thing that's worth highlighting is in China, tea production is dominated around the southeast, and in India, it's dominated around the northeast, which actually means that even though this gold looks a relatively wide section, the actual part on this map that's producing tea is really quite a narrow kind of it's the subtropics subtropics of Asia that are the traditional tea producing regions. These days, you'll actually get tea grown all over the world. A huge amount of tea in this country will come from East Africa, also Argentina, Indonesia, places like Turkey grow a lot of tea as well. But these 5 places would be considered the traditional tea growing regions, and that they tend to be the places where you will have the small gardens, all of this idea of kind of knowledge and expertise being handed down. It's also the places where the cultivars of the Camellia sinensis have traditionally been cultivated, and that's to say they've been adapted to the specific terroirs in those places. Impact of origin on taste, again, you know all of this from wine specifically, and I think we're going to cover, when we do the tasting, we'll cover each of these points, but exactly in the same way that wine, the taste of the wine will change depending on the terroir. It's exactly the same for tea. So altitude has a huge impact on the taste. It's mostly linked to, and like a lot of the best teas that we'll taste will be high grown up the mountains. The idea is that you have a mist higher up the mountain in subtropical climates that tends to protect the tea bushes from the sun. I mean, they produce certain polyphenols that tend to be like the more aromatic, fruity, fresh, sweet flavors, not the bitter flavors. High altitude, you have longer winter, so longer rest times for the tea bushes. You also have bigger differences between daytime and nighttime temperatures. It means the tea bushes grow slowly, so they have longer to develop their flavors. Soil, again, I'm going to cover this when we taste the Wui Oolong, but it will have a big impact on the taste. Rainfall or water irrigation, again, it's to do with how quickly the tea bushes will grow. Sunlight, like I said, some of it's to do with not producing the polyphenols that taste bitter, but also some of it's about if you can control the level of sunlight through either shading or covering your tea bushes, you can bring out and extract certain flavors. And of course, people. And within people, I mean people, community, culture, this idea of know-how and an approach, and how you approach farming and how you approach your land will have a big impact on the taste of the tea. Final one is season. So tea is incredibly seasonal. I think this is something, again, when we imagine the kind of endless boxes of tea bags on the shelf in the supermarket, it's difficult to think that actually some of the best teas will only be produced for about 4 weeks of the year. So this early spring period tends to be, in China and Japan, tends to be the most prized season, and linked to this idea of altitude and where the tea bushes, where the Camellia sinensis thrives, you have this relatively short spring where the first buds, the first shoots will come through after this long winter dormancy. Those first buds will contain all of the freshest, like all of the nutrients that the plant's been storing up over the winter, and all of the kind of fresh spring flavors that are incredibly prized in green and white tea. Summer is a relatively big picking season as well. It tends to be more important in places like Assam. So hopefully Assam is a region in northeast India that any tea drinkers on this call will definitely know. It's one of the places where often English breakfast will still come from Assam. Summer is the best time of year to pick, summer produces the highest quality teas in Assam. And that's again just to do with flavor, like preference for flavor and taste, and what the weather is doing at that time of year. In autumn, you will find certain oolongs being picked and processed and prized. And by the time winter comes, there's not much happening. There's some parts of Sri Lanka will produce some high quality teas over the winter, but typically winter is when these tea bushes will have their chance to recover, rest, and build up, go deep, let the roots go deep and build up their flavors ready for the next season. What makes the different types of tea? Like I said, it's basically, once I've picked the leaf, how I choose to dry it, and whether or not I choose to manipulate it or bruise it before I dry it decides whether or not I'm going to get white tea, green tea, yellow tea, black tea, etc. It's oxidation is a key part of tea processing as well, which if we look at the next slide, hopefully will make sense. And I'm assuming again that you guys all understand oxidation, this idea of breaking the leaf, oxygen comes in, reacts with the enzymes, changes them. In the context of tea, like the major impact of oxidation is a concentration of flavor. These are the 6 types of tea. On the right-hand side, we've got herbal. I thought it was worth just putting that on there as well. Often they're called herbal teas. They're not actually tea because they're nothing to do with the Camellia sinensis plant. So we treat them slightly separately. And actually from the Camellia sinensis plant, we will have 6 different types of tea: green, white, yellow, oolong, black, and pu'er. Today, Will and I have selected a green tea, an oolong tea, and a black tea for us to try. So hopefully we'll get an idea of this an idea of this concept of concentration of flavor going through those 3 types. But we can, and if we need to, we can kind of come back and reference this slide. But very broadly, green tea is the tea, the leaves are picked, the leaves and the buds are picked, and the processing means that, like, what you're trying to do when you make green tea is basically lock the leaf in its green state. They fix it or lock it using heat. So pick the leaf and heat it up relatively quickly after it's been picked, lock it in its green state. And in that, you're locking in these spring fresh, grassy, quite vegetal flavors. White tea is the least processed of all the tea types. And it's literally just picked and left to very, very slowly wither. Because there's no heat applied to white tea, what that means is that you don't ever kill the enzymes, you don't ever kind of lock it in its white state. Instead, you will dry it very carefully, you'll dry it very slowly, reduce the moisture content to a point where like the oxidation will still happen, but it will happen very, very, very slowly. So really over a course of years. But white tea, typically, there are some very good aged white teas, and it's becoming a more popular thing in China now, but typically the best white teas, and this, like the ones that, like, you're looking for this light delicacy, sweet flavors, tend to be drunk very soon, very quickly after the spring, so after they're first picked and then slowly dried. Yellow tea is a very rare type of tea. It's a tea that we come across, like, good examples, like not even every year, like every 3 years perhaps, and there's very few people still producing yellow tea, and that's because it's a relatively, well, there's a low demand for it in China, which is where it comes from, but also it's a relatively risky production. What happens with it is that it's produced as a green tea, but after the fixation, instead of it being just dried and then ready to drink, it will be kept warm for a number of days. And this keeping warm, if it's done in the right way with the right humidity and the right atmosphere, it will draw out the vegetal flavors, and you'll get a kind of mellow, a very mellow but still fresh tea. Oolong tea we're going to dive into when we taste it, but it's this category that sits in between green and black. So green tea, you've got as fresh as possible, kind of locked in its original state. Black tea, you've got full oxidation, full concentration flavors, rich, robust, lots of structure. Oolong is semi-oxidized, and within that you can get 10% oxidation all the way through to 90% oxidation. So it's this category that's kind of bridging the gap between the two. What that means, and because to an extent because of the processing, is a really kind of rich, loads and loads of different flavors basically within oolong to dive into. They also tend to be like wonderfully complex. They tend to be, you have lots of floral flavors, lots of fruity flavors, really satisfying. If no one's tried oolong, we're going to try it today. But also I would say it's one of the categories, or the most common category, that people that I've worked with that don't really drink much tea, or don't kind of want to dive into it more but don't really know where to start. This is the category that can be really accessible, but also delivering on complexity. And then finally you have pu'er. Pu'er is often categorized by being an aged type of tea. It's a very specific type that only comes from the Yunnan province in China. It's made from a very specific type of the Camellia sinensis plant, or very specific cultivar that's indigenous to Yunnan. There are 2 broad subcategories, raw and cooked. Raw tends to be when the pu'er has been left to age and ferment naturally. Cooked tends to be when the pu'er has been, like, the aging process has been sped up, and you'll get 2 like different flavors and different tastes depending on which subcategory of this pu'er or aged tea you try. Pu'er is also one of Will's specialities. So if anyone at the end has questions on pu'er, we're not going to taste one today, but if you have questions on pu'er, then definitely shout out, because at the end, Will is the man to talk about pu'er.
Awesome.
Is that all the slides for this? Yes.
That is, yes. So yeah,
Right.
I'm going to now hand over to Will to kick off with the first tea.
Excellent. I think we had one question already. Maybe you want to answer that very quickly, Felicity. How does the tannin and caffeine content vary with the various teas? Actually, that's quite a big question. So I think we'll cover that as we go, because as we taste through the teas, that will probably become quite apparent. Caffeine is always a question we get, and a very good question indeed. But let's kick off by tasting something, because I know you're probably all anticipating actually getting your taste buds around some of these teas. So hopefully you should have your teas with you, with your kettle ready to go. If not, you can boil your kettle now, and make sure that you do grab some extra cold water, because I'm going to give you a few tips and tricks as we go along so that you can get the best out of these teas. And the first one we're going to try is organic jade sword. So if you have the sachets, I see some of you do, that look like this. It'll be a gold sachet with a green band on it called organic jade sword. I don't have any sachets, so I'm going to actually weigh my tea out. What you can do is, all the tea is pre-weighed, so all you have to do is rip open that sachet and you can pour it straight into your tea-air or teapot. So it's enough for kind of at the perfect single cup. Should be about 4 grams, which I'm going to weigh out myself. And as you open them, you should notice a few things. Obviously, it's a loose leaf tea, so there'll be lots of leaves in there rather than being in a tea bag. And just from looking at it, we can start to assess a few things. So when we look at new teas, we get a fresh sample in, for example. There's always a process we go through when we're tasting these teas. I mean, I like to do it if I'm just trying a new tea I've never tried before anyway, and that's to see, then smell, and then taste. The seeing part is obviously the first part you can do. So from looking at this tea, we can see that it is made up of lots of small kind of wiry green leaves. The size of the leaf is a good indication of perhaps seasonality. So we can even see there's some specks of silver in there as well. And any specks that you see in a tea that's quite silvery, especially with a green tea like this, it's often the buds. And the buds of the tea plant are covered in these tiny hairs, which give this silvery color to the leaves. So the fact that we can see some hints of silver and some very small young leaves gives us an indication that this has been picked and processed probably in the early spring, which is obviously, as Felicity mentioned, the season that we want to look for our green tea, when the tea plants literally spring back to life after the winter, full of all the nutrients that they've stored up, and hopefully looking to capture all of that spring fresh flavor. So there's a lot you can tell just from looking at the leaves. Now, in terms of smell, that can be a little bit hard with a dry tea, because dry teas don't really give off any fragrance. All of that scent is trapped inside of this dry tea. So the best thing we can do, I know some of you would have poured your tea leaves into your tea air already. So if you have done that, you can try this with the next tea. It will work for everything, but I'm going to show you a quick tip on getting the aroma. So I'm going to take my empty tea air, which I have here. I'm going to fill it up with a little bit of hot water, essentially just preheat it, right? And because our tea airs are made of glass, it's not going to take very long. Just a few seconds really, make sure it's nice and hot. Once it's nice and hot, I can get rid of this hot water, and then I can add my dry tea leaves in. And that excess steam, that excess heat is going to start to release the aroma of the tea. So we can actually capture the authentic fragrance. So yeah, we're getting hints slightly vegetal, a little bit creamy, and very, very refreshing, a little bit of warmth as well. All good signs for what we're looking for in a green tea. So if you ever want to get the proper fragrance, if you're in a tea shop or you're trying a new tea for the first time, try and preheat your teaware to help release that aroma, and you can get a very good smell of what it's actually like. Yeah, I often indulge in the fragrance of a tea because I do love it. It's a thing that people often overlook, but I think it's so good. All right, so when we're ready to infuse, now that we've had a look at our leaves, we've had a smell of our leaves, now we want to taste. For green teas, it's super important that we use the correct temperature. A lot of people find this maybe a little bit bewildering or kind of difficult to achieve. But again, I have a very simple trick to achieve the correct temperature for green tea, which is 80 degrees. The reason why we don't want to use boiling water is because boiling water, all of that heat from that boiling water will extract all of the bitter compounds from the green tea and cause a lot of bitterness and astringency in our infusion. What we want is something sweet and something smooth. So to do that, we just lower the temperature ever so slightly, mitigate that flavor, and draw out the best of the tea leaves. So to get 80 degrees, really, really simply, it's hardly rocket science. All I'm going to do is add a little bit of cold water first. So I've got my filter jug here with some fresh cold water. And I'm going to add in just under the handle, about a fifth of the amount of my teapot or tiare. So just enough cold water to really cover the leaves just below the handle. That way, when I add my boiling water, which I have in my jug here, it's going to reduce the temperature down a few degrees. Again, it's not an exact science, but it will get us very much in the ballpark of around 70 to 80 degrees, which is absolutely perfect for green teas. So that's a great rule of thumb for any green teas, especially Chinese green teas. Just making them a little bit cooler will help to ensure you get a sweet flavor and maybe not that bitter infusion that you might be used to with your green teas. And often it's that really unlocks green tea for a lot of people, just using the correct temperature to ensure the best flavor. Now I've popped my lid on and I've turned over my tea timer. I don't know if you guys were sent these, but they're 3 minutes. So that's how long we're going to infuse this tea for. I will make sure I keep an eye on the time and I will tell you when you need to pour. When you do need to pour your tea out, I would like you all to pour everything. Right, we don't want to leave any water infusing with the tea leaves. If you have a big mug, your standard sized mug, your favorite one, pour all of your tea into that in one perfect cup. We don't want to pour out half and leave it then to continue to infuse, pour out the second half and have that be too strong. We want one perfect infusion. All right, so for a couple of minutes while that's infusion, what I'd like to do is do a bit of traveling, which is super exciting given that we've been in lockdown for so long. I'm sure many of you have had the urge to travel. So I'm going to try and fulfill a little bit of that today by sharing a map here. So hopefully you can all see this on screen. Felicity, is that up? Awesome. All right. So clearly we have an overview of Southeast Asia here. We have the Indian continent down to Sri Lanka, covering some of the origins we spoke about. Of course, we have China, all the way around to Taiwan and up into Japan. But for this green tea, what we're going to do is we're going to travel to the origin, which is this green marker here in Hunan province in south central China. Now, as I zoom in, we're going to get a good understanding of why we love this area for spring green teas, some of which will become obvious if I stop right about here. So a few things about terroir are already going to become apparent, which I'm sure you're used to in terms of looking at wines. The first of which is mountains. So we can see a rough outline of the topography here that there's a lot of mountains in this region. It's kind of covered in this mountain faces warping all the way across the map. We also have a natural water source, a huge river running down through the province here, which is going to give a lot of fertility to the soil, make sure it's nice and hydrated. And the other thing that's very obvious to note is it's super green, right? So this tea is actually an organic tea, it comes from an organic certified garden. So we're looking at a very untouched rural area where the tea is really grown in accordance with the environment. So if I zoom in, we're going to get a better view of what life is like in the region. Because obviously the tea is harvested by people. And a lot of these people in Hunan, especially in rural areas surrounding the tea gardens, live in these small villages. So a lot of the time in China, we find that tea is under the control, the processing, the picking of families, small companies, cooperatives, when we're looking at single garden, especially, these are not huge tea estates. They're very, very small plots of land that have perhaps been in the ownership of generations of tea masters, with the knowledge handed down from one generation to the next. So we often see little villages like this surrounded by hints of agriculture, perhaps in the valley of the mountains. But as we work our way up, we can begin to see, and it's a little bit difficult on this, but here we can begin to see up the mountains, these ridges, and these are the hedgerows of tea gardens that really are built into the side of the mountain. So I can show you a better picture of this once we dive into the tea maker behind this tea. But you can begin to see, as we move higher up, about 800 meters, the actual landscape of the garden. And in fact, if I spin the map, you can get a much better idea of what the region is actually like. So bamboo and pine forests integrated all around the mountains with small tea gardens, with this very typical tea terraces, these hedgerows of tea really built into the side of the mountain. And you can see as you go up and up the mountains in the distance, there's pockets of agriculture, perhaps other crops like rice and corn and vegetables, and lots of small villages in control of producing these crops. And if I zoom out again, just the absolutely classical, stunning Chinese landscape that, you know, if you're looking for tea, you're definitely looking in the right place if you find somewhere that looks like this. Just absolutely stunning. All right, so I think we're about ready to pour. Yes, we are. So if you want to take your tea airs and you can just pour it straight out. I'm decanting mine into another tea air because I drink a lot of tea through the day. So I like to ration it into small cups to make sure I don't overdo it. And once it's all out, you want to make sure you get every last drop, because those last drops are often going to be the drops that really contain the flavor, the richness of the tea. And once you're happy, you can take the lid off, let that excess steam out, so that when you're tasting, you can actually, again, once the leaves cool down, perhaps have a look at them or get more of that aroma of the wet leaf, because it's always fascinating to see how the aromas change as well as the taste. But in terms of the taste, you can go ahead and try it. It should be nice and cool. Another advantage of using 80-degree water is that once it's been left to infuse, especially in glass, which is a great material for making any kind of tea, it will naturally cool down fairly evenly and not too rapidly, but rapidly enough that when you pour it out, it should be nice and ready to drink in terms of temperature. Especially, you don't want to burn your tongue when you're doing a tea tasting. So if it is a little bit too hot, you can let it cool down further. All right, does anyone have any initial thoughts? Anyone? I see you're all having a tentative sip. Anyone have any thoughts on green tea? Maybe how this compares to anything they've tried before? Or perhaps any relationships you can see already with wine beginning to form?
Very fragrant, isn't it? It's very quite a delicate flavour and quite long.
Yes, yeah, not super intense, but enough flavor there to be enticing, I think. I think a lot of the time people get their initial experience of green tea as something that's very punchy, very, very bold, very, very vegetal, often because they're using too hot water or perhaps a lower quality leaf, where it's crushed, and those kind of leaves that are more crushed, less whole leaf, less intact, mean there's more surface area, so a much quicker extraction. Using a nice higher quality loose leaf tea means that you get these whole leaves, which are going to very unfurl and extract their flavor very evenly.
Really surprised by how there's no bitterness. When I've had green tea before, I've obviously been using not high quality and boiling water and extracting all those bitternesses and bitter flavors, and here there's none of that. It's delicious.
Yes, I'm equally guilty, Laura. On the hot boiling water front.
I mean, we all are. It's honestly, I was the same when I first got into tea, because no one tells you these things, and it's it's a very simple tip of just using a little bit of cold water first, switching to whole leaf or loose leaf tea, and it changes the game. So I'm glad. I'm really glad.
Isn't it? Very delicate.
The flavour persists for a long time.
Yes, it should do. So again, when we're tasting teas, you often, and I know that you guys will understand this in tasting wine, but you have the initial taste, but you also have the finish. How does it taste once you swallowed? What flavors are left in the mouth? What's the sensation that you're getting in the mouth? I often find with green tea, I get a sensation on the tongue, especially towards the back of the throat, a kind of sweetness developing, a very rich, satisfying, almost vegetal flavor as well. And often if you get a green tea that's too bitter or astringent, you'll feel it on the sides of your cheeks and the sides of your tongue. It's very drying astringency, which is not a good sign in some cases.
So which is this presumably not this year's green tea? Is it?
Yes, yeah, this is spring 2020, yes. So it's a very good point. So we're actually just receiving our spring teas from 2021 because the season in China would have just finished a few weeks ago. So obviously the teas we're selecting the harvest and then we're importing them. So that could be a little bit of process, but yeah, it's actually a very exciting time of year because we're literally getting these fresh spring green teas in, and it's always an exciting period because, you know, it's the teas that you look forward to every year, the fresh harvests. But this is definitely still a very, very good representation of a fresh, fresh green tea. Awesome.
Is tea usually consumed then within the year?
That's a good question. For green teas, yes, I would say you do want to kind of drink them at their freshest. But in terms of green teas and teas in general, their flavors will last if you store them really well, store them correctly. We have our bags or in our sachets where they're airtight, away from other smells, away from too high temperatures, too low temperatures. They'll last for many, many years. So we have I think 3 years on our best before dates, but often teas will roll on past that for sure.
So just an observation, I suppose, because obviously over here when we drink wine, we're quite we pay attention to the vintage, don't we? Whereas in China, I think sometimes wines are not labeled with vintage, but it's sometimes the opposite with tea, because in tea, especially when the season is for new tea, all the teas will be labeled new tea, so it's the latest vintage, I suppose, of green tea.
Exactly.
But do you think that might be something that might come to the international market, where actually labeling tea with the year might catch on?
Yeah, I do hope so. It's something that we do with all of our teas. So whenever we get them in, we often do, on our product pages, we'll also do a deep dive on our journals. So you can find out everything from the elevation it was picked at to the cultivar, who made it, what vintage. But hopefully, yes, I really do think that more people should. And it's one of the things that you should be looking for when you're picking your tea, as well as the origin. Perhaps you could begin to look at cultivar and understand that, but vintage, so year of production, is quite important. It might not mean anything to you at first, but the more you begin to understand these things and the relationship between perhaps the terroir and the taste, they'll really become very, very relevant indeed. And I know Felicity won't want me going too hard down the pu'er route yet, because it's not a tea we're going to drink, but it's very, very important for teas that are aged like pu'er. Vintage is, very important. So it's a great point.
Cool, thank you.
Right. Awesome. So I think I'm going to run through some pictures very quickly. What I suggest is, if you want to empty your TES, we're going to move on to the next tea as I run through these pictures. The next one will be Wui Oolong. So if you want to rinse out your TES, and perhaps you could grab another mug, you can always save your green tea and drink it as we go on later. But I'm going to share my screen and run through some pictures of Jade Sword while we do that. All right, so as you saw on the map, the mountains in Hunan with the hedgerows that run across the mountains. This is a much better image of that. It might not have looked that high up on the Google Maps, but in real life it is actually pretty high, and you can see that by the dwarfing of the large building in the background. The other thing to note about this as well is the real integration of these tea bushes into the mountainside. So you have a large amount of biodiversity, which is a very good sign when we're looking for an organic garden. making sure that there's a great environment for the tea bushes and the wildlife that exists in these areas. Okay, so this is the tea producer, Mr. Joel Wei, with some of his associates heading down to the garden in March last year to make a batch of jade sword. And you can see a few things in this. You can begin to see the rock in the background, which we'll come on to when we speak about Wui Oolong, but the minerality in the soil is often really important. And something that tea farmers will make you consider when you visit gardens. They'll make you, feel the soil, the texture of the soil, the makeup of the soil can be quite interesting. The other point about Joe Wei is that he actually brought this tea garden back to life. So the land that the tea grows on was a tea garden. It's always been a tea garden, but it was abandoned in, I think, the 1980s or 90s when Mr. Joe Wei was a younger man. Which meant there was no tea production for the community, which is obviously a shame, given that a lot of the people in the area produce tea. It's something that they always do. So when Mr. Joe Wei grew up, he decided to come back to the area, re-establish the tea garden, replant the whole garden, and get an organic certification to kind of bring back green tea production to the community, which is an admirable, very good thing indeed. And then finally, we have a look at some of the freshly picked tea leaves. So to be honest, they are not too dissimilar to what you'll see in your tea air, which is really, really interesting. These very tender, very young leaves. You can see how small they are. All of these would be picked by hand as well. So you have highly trained, highly skilled people who go in, pick individual leaves with the buds, making sure that they pick the best material so that you can produce the best tea, essentially. So it's a lot of skill, a lot of labor, and a lot of effort goes into producing tea like this. All right, so those are all the pictures for Jade's sword. I'm going to stop sharing before we...
I think we'll actually leave that picture on, and then while we're making the wui, we can kind of see the place and see the origin.
Oh yeah, sure.
For everyone that's just sort of cleaned out their tea air, I would say a quick reminder, what Will showed you earlier about getting the fragrance and the aromatics from the tea is like, now is definitely the time to do it. Wui Oolong is a highly aromatic tea. And I think, yeah, heat up your teapot and let's dive into some of the aromas. You'll see from the color of the leaf that this is actually kind of more concentrated, heavily oxidized end of the oolong spectrum. Actually, has anyone heard of Wui Oolong, or anyone heard of like oolong teas, rock teas from rock oolongs from the Wui Mountains before?
Oolong.
Yeah, like this area, Wuishan, it's one of the most famous areas for. Put that there for oolong tea. It's actually where the processing and the idea of oolong tea was born. For everyone that's heated up their things, let's pop the leaves in, swirl them around, and then I want to hear what aromas people get when they do this, because this is an oolong tea made from a very specific cultivar. So the type of tea bush that we can see in the picture here is. Yeah, I don't want to give you the name yet because it has like one of the things. It's going to be interesting if anyone picks up on the smell. What can people get on the nose for this one?
Something slightly chocolatey.
Chocolate cacao is a really good one. This is an oolong tea that's been baked as well, so you'll get some roast on it. But the name of the cultivar and the kind of the tea plant that we can see in this picture is actually yellow rose. So this is a relatively unusual oolong from the Wui Mountains, in that it goes big on the floral notes and less on the kind of roasted, like sometimes oolongs from Wui Mountains can be really quite roasted, almost kind of have caramel flavors. But what we've selected here is an oolong that's big on floral. So does anyone get kind of rose or general kind of light meadow freshness from this actually very quite dark tea. A little bit maybe. Let's make the tea. So let's add our water. In this instance, we're adding boiling water, so hot water. It's good because we've got this concentration of flavor. You actually want the heat from the water to bring out that structure that's going to deliver the flavors across the palate.
I will do the timer, the honors again as well.
Thank you. So Oolong, like I said, is one of the most famous, or it's in Fujian, so it's like south of where we just traveled from in Hunan. We've gone down to Fujian, into Wuishan. It's a national park. It's a UNESCO biodiversity hotspot. It's UNESCO protected hotspot, biodiversity hotspot. It's a land that's made up of ancient volcanoes. And what you get is kind of these craggy, you can see actually in this picture, the red soil, lots of craggy mountainsides, lots of tall mountains. I think there's 9 different rivers, small rivers running through this area, that all come together to make it an incredibly fertile place. This, coupled with the fact it's the birthplace of that it's a very culturally important origin for oolong tea even today in China. And teas, so some of you might have heard of teas called things like Big Red Robe, which come from this place, and they will, like, every year they will kind of be sold off and like bought, like often by a lot of dignitaries to give as gifts, and like given a lot of cultural capital to teas specifically from this place. This one though is a relatively new cultivar. Like I said, it's this yellow rose cultivar, delivering more florality, more lightness, but hopefully you'll get this in the cup, but coupled with this unique taste of the Wuyi Mountains, which really comes from this mineral rocky soil, mineral rocky soil.
I have to be very honest.
This is a picture of Mr. Zhong, who produces this. As you can see, he's quite a young farmer. He has, again, like a lot of people in Wuyi, taken over from his father. Because this is an area that is protected by UNESCO and protected by a number of local government organisations. You can even see this picture. It's full of other plants. You're not allowed to use pesticides. You're not allowed to use chemical fertilizers in this national park, which makes it a great place for producing tea and also a great place to be a tea farmer. Zhong's garden is relatively high up. Again, you can see from this picture, he's really, really high up in Wuishan. And then this is, again, gives you a really good impression of this idea of these craggy, red-soiled mountain, like literally kind of crags, and you kind of weave your way through them. It's a relatively big place, and you can kind of weave your way all throughout this entire national park in between these big red rocks. And I think, like, somehow, and I don't know quite what's the best way to describe this, but if you see something and you imagine how it would taste, I think that this tea and its origin are the most similar in terms of looking at that, and then when we taste the tea and thinking, okay, yeah, that is how I would imagine red soil to taste in a delicious way, because I don't imagine that soil tastes all that nice.
Our time is up.
Oh, perfect.
Perfect time.
As before,
Yes.
Felicity, what are we talking about in terms of altitude? Because it looks really, really high.
So here we're at about 1,200 meters.
Thank you.
What you'll have in places like, well, not in places like in Taiwan, you'll actually have tea growing up to 3,000 meters up. Also in Darjeeling, that would be relatively 2,000 to 3,000 meters as well, where the tea bushes are.
How long do tea bushes live for? I mean, is there a sort of culture of old bushes rather like there is with old vines, or are they planted quite regularly?
A little bit, yes, but that's really specific to Yunnan and to Pu'er. So, and or lots of these old tea bushes as well will be used to make black teas these days in Yunnan as well. But a tea bush, a Camellia sinensis could last, I mean, some of them claim to be 1,000 years old, or some areas.
You don't get to find that old.
1,000 years old. I think like I've drunk teas from bushes that are over 100 years old, and that seems to be slightly more common, but in almost like normal practice, their lifespan is about 30. Lifespan of being cultivated is about 30 years. What's also happening, and I guess this is really similar to wine, is that very often different gardens will be like producing new cultivars all the time, adapting to the changing climate, adapting to preferences and flavors, innovation, etc., which also speaks to Liz's point. Liz has put in the chat, is there a movement for new younger growers to take over and make them more specialties than their predecessors? Yes, but what we're seeing mostly is that the younger generations are the people who are making the switch, rather than necessarily like more specialties, organic, changing the practices. That seems to be something that is being spearheaded by the younger generations, or like innovation, like innovative. Yeah, I guess innovation around kind of how they process the tea or how they pick it. That people tend to be relatively committed to the type of tea they produce in a specific region and the cultivar or the type of tea bush that they will use. But innovation in terms of like how much you might dry it and how much you might, oxidize it or wither it and all of that is very common. But typically the younger generations we're seeing are more committed to changing agricultural practices so they have better future. I guess it's kind of for them, for their families, but also for the planet. What are people getting from the taste of the wui? No, it's like a huge amount darker than the green tea. I mean, often it kind of looks almost like a black tea. If someone's getting smoky, yeah, so that idea of it being roasted. Rosemary already picked up on the dark chocolate notes. It's a little bit like, a lot of people will get peach fruitiness from this. Almost, I always think if you imagine fruit, for me, it's not fruit that you've kind of freshly picked and, taken a bite of. It's fruit that's probably been cooked, maybe a little bit caramelized. Got a kind of deep, darker flavor.
Yeah, I think with this tea as well, there's a lot of spices in there. So you can get things like cinnamon. Yeah, I see some agreement there. Yeah, definitely. Cinnamon, maybe some ginger. Often found in these kinds of teas, as well as a rich roastiness. We often find that people who say come into our shop and say, I really like coffee, I don't drink tea, I'm just in here with my husband or wife who wants to buy some tea, and they try this and they're like, actually this is really good. It's our go-to coffee converter almost. Stewed plum and cinnamon. Yes, exactly.
Well, I'm going to take the opportunity just before we move on to the final tea to answer, I think it was Victor's question about how does the tannin and caffeine content vary with the different teas, because I think this, looking at the wui and your jade sword side by side, you might be surprised to know that there's broadly around the same amount of caffeine in both of these cups of tea. We tested all of our teas a number of years ago now, and we did find that doesn't really matter green through to Pu'er. Well, green through to black. Pu'er is a little bit different because of this aging process. You'd have to test every single one to know the caffeine content. But green through to black, they all contain broadly the same amount of caffeine. How you extract caffeine exactly the same way as extracting the flavor, it's heat and it's time. So because we made the green tea with cooler water, you won't have extracted as much caffeine as you will when we've made this one with boiling water, but actual content in the leaf will be the same. And tannin in tea is a really interesting one. Lots of people will, lots of schools of tea thinking will say actually it's not actually tannin that exists in the tea leaf, it's something slightly different that's very specific to tea. But there is certainly the compound that brings out astringency, and that compound is much more prominent or gets brought out more prominently in the process during the course of oxidation. So you will get more of this tannin, if we want to call it tannin or kind of whatever. In this instance, I think we'll call it tannin. You'll get more of this the more heavily oxidized the tea is. So you'll feel that this one's much more drying than, say, the jade sword that you tried first. What do people think of the Wui Oolong?
It's very refreshing.
Very refreshing.
Lovely.
What roughly is the caffeine content?
What roughly is it? So broadly, it's about 40 micrograms per cup, like per 250 mils. If you've made your tea with boiling water and left it for a whole leaf tea, boiling water, 3 minutes, you'll get broadly 40 micrograms per cup. That compares to about 120 micrograms in a cup of freshly filtered coffee.
Yeah, it's usually less than half in that sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's a better way to say it.
Awesome.
I like it. It's refreshing and it's got quite a long flavour.
Yes, and actually, Jill, I was just going to bring up that point. There's one thing about this tea. Felicity mentioned the fact that it tastes like its place. In terms of the way the place looks, very rocky, very minerally, very green. You find that in this tea, but one of the culturally important things about this tea is that in China, they're referred to, this style of oolong from the Wui Mountains is referred to as yancha, which means rock or cliff oolong or cliff tea. And that's because in the Finnish, you get this minerality, which is called yen yen or rock rime. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it absolutely perfectly, but rock rime. And you feel it on the tongue, maybe at the back of the throat, this minerality that begins to appear as you continue to drink the tea. And that is a really important taste element of this kind of oolong that, again, it maybe shows a cultural difference in the way we taste, because in China and Asia, they have many, many different textures as well. They think about how things feel in the mouth, but also they have these almost esoteric understandings of the way things should be and the way that they perceive flavors. So you might also have an experience of cha qi if you drink enough tea, which is the tea energy that fills the body if you have a very, very long tea session or a particularly strong tea that has this cha qi. So there are many ways that you can taste tea as you move around the world, many ways to explore the flavors. Awesome. So I think we'll move on to our final one, and I know we've gone slightly over time, so we'll try and run through this one fairly quickly so that you can enjoy the rest of the sunshine. Hopefully it'll stay around for the rest of the day. So if you want to clear out your tiers, and we'll jump on to the last tea, which is going to be Red Dragon. So this is a pretty unique tea, I would say, and hopefully this one is going to bring home the idea of cultivar and terroir, so the tea plants themselves and where they're grown and how that affects the flavor, along with the people, the local expertise that goes into producing these teas. All right. One thing I would say as well, while we're all swapping over our tiers, is that if you wanted to, you can always infuse these teas cold. If you wanted a different experience, while we're tasting them, it's nice to enjoy them hot, because that's normally how we would try teas. But a lot of these teas, especially something like Organic Jade Sword, as the sun does try to appear more often throughout the year, you can use cold infusion to get an even sweeter and more refreshing flavor out of your tea. And to do that, all you need to do is add twice the amount of leaf for the same amount of water. So if you're using a 250 milliliter tier, you would add 8 grams or 2 sachets of leaf, add some cold water and leave it to infuse in your fridge or somewhere ambient temperature for 6 hours or maybe overnight. And you come back and you can pour it out and you'll have an absolutely delicious cup of iced green tea, which is just a completely different view of the flavors of the tea itself. So definitely worth trying.
Very exciting.
Okay. So for the last time, I'm going to preheat my tier and then add my leaves in. Now this one is, it's a black tea. So we're moving from unoxidized green tea through our semi-oxidized oolong all the way to our fully oxidized black tea. Many of you will be familiar with the fragrance of black tea, the taste of black tea, but this is something particularly special, I think. So definitely worth trying to capture the aroma, the fragrance of this tea. So this, and open the sachet. Okay. So as you open your sachets and pour your leaves in, you will again see some twisted dark leaves, a kind of almost like a miniature version of wheat oolong, it looks like, but it is indeed a black tea. And this picking is very similar to our green tea picking. So what has been picked from the tea plant is the young buds and 2 leaves to produce this. But the aroma is something very, very unique. Is anyone getting any particular sense from this? Sweet spices? Anyone getting any ginger as well, or maybe even milk chocolate?
Bit of ginger.
Yeah. Some red fruits, maybe like a cranberry or maybe goji berry.
A lot of people will find lychee in this as well.
Yeah.
I can't find fruit, but the ginger is very clear.
Yeah. So there's a real mixture of fragrances in here. And when we speak about tasting notes or aroma notes, I guess you all know this from wine, but it can be very subjective. So if you taste something that's specific to you, don't be afraid to share that or consider that in terms of the aroma or the taste of the tea, because as you taste through many, many different teas, you'll find the things that you like, and they might be personal to you, flavors that you like particularly, or, you know, a lot of people pick out flavors from their childhood, which is always quite fun, you know, particular kinds of sweets that they had when they were a kid, or maybe a food that their grandmother used to make for them. And that often makes for the best bond to a particular tea flavor. And for me, I get a really strong berry note, which reminds me of these Chinese medicinal cabinets in the shop I used to work in. It's lots and lots of different Chinese medicines, all with a very unique flavor, and I find them in this tea. But importantly, this tea marries 2 very, very particular things. The first thing is the cultivar, and the second thing is the terroir. So let's go ahead and pour our water in, and I'll tell you the story of Red Dragon. Flip this timer. So this tea came to Jing a few years ago, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Is that right for this tea? Yeah, but before that, it had gone on a bit of a journey, you could say. So about a decade ago, there was a tea farmer in Yunnan province in the southwest of China. So we're jumping from Fujian, the Wu Mountains, all the way to the other side of China. And Yunnan, which is an ancient terroir for tea, the home of pu'er, as we've said already, place that's been producing, cultivating tea for thousands of years. And there was a tea producer there, and he decided he wanted to do something slightly experimental. So what he did was he rang up his friend who lived in Taiwan, very far away, and Taiwan known for producing oolong teas at very high elevation, way up in the mountains, 2,000-3,000 meters up. And they produce these very green, very fresh and fruity oolong teas, completely different to what you'll find growing in Yunnan. But this tea farmer in Yunnan rang up his friend in Taiwan and said, I've got this idea. I want to do something experimental. I want you to bring some of your Taiwanese tea plants. We'll find the highest mountain we can in Yunnan and we'll grow them and see what happens. And this Taiwanese tea farmer obliged. They took some cuttings of this Taiwanese tea cultivar that had been bred in Taiwan for many, many years, very particular to that region, transported them to Yunnan, found a high mountain, planted them, and waited for 5 years, because that's how long it can take for tea plants to reach maturity. So pretty radical, very experimental. And at the end of those 5 years, when they finally could harvest the leaves, instead of producing an oolong tea, which you would expect, it being a cultivar that is bred to produce oolong teas, they used the local expertise in Yunnan to produce a black tea, because as well as pu'er, Yunnan is really known for producing these wonderful malty and very rich black teas. So what you have is a combination of this local expertise, this cultivar from Taiwan, and this high mountain terroir to create an incredibly unique flavor that you won't really find anywhere else. There are not many people who are willing to take the risk to try and achieve something like this, but it totally paid off. So much so that when Tom, our head of tea at Jing, tasted this tea for the first time, he literally flew straight to the garden to meet the producers, to work with them, to understand what they were doing, and bought the entire batch of this tea because it's just so special. And we've been buying it ever since. So it's a very, very unique black tea, and we're very lucky to have it, I think. Very lucky discovery for us. So it is almost ready to pour. I'll give it a few more seconds, but you can already see, it's hard to see on the screen perhaps, but you can see the color of this is absolutely stunning, kind of amber orange. Very, very beautiful. Another good aspect of using glass is that you can really be mesmerized by what's happening in your teapot. All right, okay, so we're good to go. Let's pour this out and have a taste. I know you can probably all hear that pouring sound as well, but it's maybe one of the most satisfying sounds I know. So in terms of the color when we pour it out, it isn't too dissimilar to the Wui Oolong, because the Wui Oolong is at the darker end of the Oolong spectrum. So we're taking only a few short steps into black tea here to 100% of fully oxidized tea. But you'll find there is a really remarkable change in flavor. You don't have that roastedness. You might have some of the same sweet spices, but not so much caramel. We really move into more of the kind of malty and rich flavors that you expect from a black tea, but with this very, very unique fruity, maybe even slightly floral and spicy element of the Oolong cultivar really coming through. Anyone find that? How does it compare to perhaps your normal black tea bags?
Ooh, it's much better. But I don't use tea bags, but it just, this has got fragrance and it's kind of got a lovely, elegant richness to it.
Yeah, elegant, yes.
But yeah, it's got a lot of depth, but it's elegant at the same time.
Yes.
And the tannin is actually quite restrained, I find.
Yeah. That's the thing with a lot of Chinese black teas. You have because they're often grown at elevation. Yunnan is, I mean, you're looking at 1,600 meters, which is pretty high up. Because you have that cooler temperature, you don't have so much of that direct sunlight because the plants are protected by mist. They're not being hit by those sun rays, which can often develop the stronger flavors in black tea, which you would look for in something like an Assam or maybe a Ceylon black tea. But in this case, you want more of those aromatics, much more of those complexities coming through, which is why you would select something a bit more high mountain. Laura says it's very exotic. Yeah, I think so too.
Lovely.
Awesome. So while you're enjoying that, if anyone has any thoughts on this tea, do not be afraid to shout out. But does anyone have any final questions for us? Because I know we're 50 minutes over.
We'll forgive you. It's been such fun and
awesome.
Horizon broadening.
Excellent.
It's delicious.
Is there anything that we didn't cover that you were specifically looking to know about tea? Perhaps some recommendations or what to try next?
Where's your shop?
Oh yes, our shop is on St. Christopher's Place in London, right next to Selfridges, right by Bond Street Station. And if you go there, we have our wall of teas. We have almost every tea that's available on the website ready to try. So you can actually go in there and try all the teas. If you're not sure what you want to try, you can ask one of our staff and they'll be happy to help you. So you can taste your way through some of the teas before you buy them. It's always quite fun.
Oh, wow.
The other thing to note, though, is I know that Olivia, who works on our website, she has set up a discount code, a personal discount code for everyone in Circle of Wine Writers Club for the site, which will give you 20% off. So I know Andrea has that to share around with everyone.
Great, thank you.
Yes, I hope it went out. If not, we'll make sure it goes round to people. It runs until the end of the month, so have to get a move on if you want to order some.
How do you break the tea? Sorry, did someone have a question? Is that Victor?
Sorry, I
Oh,
think
Marie.
Marie.
Marie, yes. How do you break the leaves from a tea cake?
I've been given quite a few. I've been given quite a few tea cakes, the really old ones.
Yes.
How do you take a bit off without, getting it in tiny bits? Because there's one that's like, 75 years old, and I don't even dare touch it because it's so hard. I think it'll kill my husband if I haven't tapped it on his head.
Yeah, be careful with that. 75-year-old tea, that's pretty
Wow,
old. That
very,
might be some
very
valuable
old.
tea. I would recommend looking for, I will type this in the chat. There's a very particular kind of, sorry.
Because I mean, some people say, steam it, but I'm like, if you steam the tea, you've ruined,
Were
you made it all.
Yeah, you don't want to steam it. You can get a very particular kind of pick. It's a short, almost like a letter opener. And what you can do with that is you can needle it into the cake and kind of wiggle it around.
Wiggle.
Yeah, and it will slowly release the leaves. You
Okay.
do need to be very careful, especially with aged tea, because it's very crumbly.
Yeah,
but I would say, try and use one of those and just try and prise the leaves apart
It's
very
at the
slowly.
edge. I haven't tasted it because I mean it's in a it's paper, and then it's in a cardboard box with openings and everything.
Oh wow.
Yeah, okay, all right. And
Awesome.
second question to ask you now, a lot of people in China actually say to drink like the green teas that the second the second round, as it were, is much sweeter and nicer than the first. What is your take on this?
Yeah, so when we're drinking teas in the tiare, one thing I haven't mentioned is you can always re-infuse your leaves. So with the Red Dragon, for example, I'm going to drink this infusion, a really delicious cup. I'm going to save these leaves, make sure you take the lid off so that you can let that excess steam out. And then you can add fresh boiling water, re-infuse again for another 3 minutes, and you should have same delicious cup. I think what you might be alluding to as well is the fact that in China, they have a very different approach to preparing tea, in terms of infusing it, which is called gongfu cha. So they use different kinds of teaware and a completely different method for producing the tea, which is much more concentrated. They use many more leaves to much less water. And they do very, very short infusions and many of these infusions. So you'll drink the same tea, perhaps, 12 to 20 infusions of the same tea over and over, following the infusions as the flavor changes. And in that case, the second, the third, the fourth infusion will be much more developed than the first one. Yeah.
Well, I hope everybody has enjoyed their infusions. Any further questions? Because I think we probably are a bit over time now.
Yeah.
Should probably wrap up. It's been a fascinating hour. Amazing parallels, obviously, with wine, and the level of your expertise is obviously very, very impressive. So thank you very much. I will be popping into the Jing shop and may even become a coffee convert, who knows. So thanks very much indeed. Broaden our horizons and our taste buds.